President, this war continues to inflict suffering on a staggering scale. The trauma is daily, the destruction is widespread, and the resilience of civilians is being pushed to its limits. But our commitment to assist them must not waver. Thank you.
I thank ASG Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And to begin with, I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Assistant Secretary General Jenča for their insight and contribution to today's discussion. And I welcome representative of Ukraine in the chamber. Mr. President, today's briefings painted a comprehensive picture of the latest developments on the ground, and the picture is grim. Civilian casualties are on the rise. Homes, schools, and hospitals continue to be destroyed. To top it all, there is no end in sight to all the death and suffering. Since the beginning of the year, Russia has been escalating its aggression. By March, Russia was launching more than 1,000 drones and missiles per week, terrorizing Ukrainians in their homes and shelters night after night. This month, the attacks have been particularly destructive. They culminated on the 9th of July, when Russia launched its largest ever aerial attack, using more than 700 drones and missiles. This vividly illustrates the accelerating pace of the escalation. This month alone, Russia has launched more than 5,000 drones and missiles. The ramped-up aerial attacks have a devastating impact on the civilian population, as we heard. As the briefers pointed out, the numbers of civilians killed or injured have been rising sharply in the first half of 2025. In fact, June was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians in 3 years. In addition to all this, civilians across Ukraine are each day exposed to arbitrary detentions, torture, executions, and sexual violence. These acts are an obvious violation of international humanitarian law. Slovenia condemns the aggression and the latest escalatory steps, Mr. President. Slovenia welcomes all diplomatic efforts toward a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, including the latest meeting between the two countries held last Wednesday. We welcome the agreement on the POW exchange in this regard. However, the outcomes of both previous and recent talks remain insufficient. Instead of genuine peace talks, we are witnessing a surge in drone production. Instead of respect for international law, more and more armaments are being procured, including from countries under UN sanctions. Instead of reuniting families, Ukrainian children remain displaced and deported. Instead of a ceasefire, Ukrainian cities continue to burn. Mr. President, we are in a desperate need of a change of pace. We need action to prevent further civilian deaths and finally make a decisive step on the path to peace, as implored by this Council last February. For months, we have listened to pleas of members of this Council for ceasefire. To little avail. Enough time has passed. This Council needs to act. We need a ceasefire resolution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary Jenča and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for their briefings. Colleagues, we are once again gathered in this chamber to address Russia's ongoing illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. A war that continues to escalate in intensity as the Russian Federation persists in its aggression against its sovereign neighbor with increased ferocity. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 key points. First, in recent weeks, we have witnessed the most severe attacks against civilians across Ukraine in over 3 years. A relentless and sustained Russian blitz of drones, missiles, and bombs has inflicted death, destruction, and despair. Kyiv has been subjected to intense overnight missile and drone attacks. Since then, several other regions, including Dnipro, Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa, Sumy, and Vinnytsia, also came under heavy attack. Deliberate assaults continue to be launched against civilian targets, from residential blocks and hospitals to shopping centers and other critical infrastructure. Nowhere is safe for Ukraine's civilians. In the last week alone, at least 20 civilians have been killed and more than 100 injured, including several children. Russia's claim that its armed forces only attack military targets is nothing more than this distortion of the truth. The reality on the ground tells a different story, as we also just heard from Assistant Secretary General Msuya. This is in clear violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a callous disregard for civilians. Second, Mr. President, Russia's disregard for international law is having an outside impact on children who suffer some of the gravest consequences. For 3 consecutive years, the Russian armed forces have been listed in the annex of the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict for committing grave violations against Ukrainian children. From the latest report, we have learned that Russia's actions in the past year have reached new levels of brutality. In addition to the unlawful abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children, Russian forces killed and maimed 671 children, according to the report. They also attacked over 500 schools and more than 300 hospitals. This marks a 60% increase in child casualties and a staggering 150% increase in attacks on schools and hospitals compared to 2023. We recall that civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law and must not be targeted. Denmark fully supports the Secretary General's call for Russia to immediately cease all violations against children. We urge Russia to take concrete steps to prevent further violations by developing and implementing a joint action plan with the United Nations. Third, Mr. President, Russia's senseless, full-scale aggression continues in its 4th year. It must come to an end. For months, Ukraine has been ready to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. We call on Russia to accept this offer without any delay. Such a response would reflect a genuine commitment to peace. While we welcome the agreement on new exchanges of prisoners of war reached in Istanbul this week, we cannot ignore that the Kremlin continues to pursue its illegal and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This week, Russia has continued to destroy cities, killing civilians, and targeting civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. These actions undermine the foundations for peace. Mr. President, in conclusion, while Russia's attacks intensify, we increase our support for Ukraine. We reiterate our call for a just, sustainable, and lasting peace in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We have reaffirmed the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, until the Ukrainians can once again live in peace and freedom in their own country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I would like to thank ASG Miroslav Zhenka and ASG Joyce Msuya. Thank you for your briefings, which recalled the gravity of the situation. President, a week ago, President Zelensky said once again that he was prepared to partake in direct peace talks with the Russian president. What was Russia's response? Massive strikes on Ukrainian cities, very far from the front line, and this between the 20th and 21st of July. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, arrived in Kiev just a few hours later to reiterate our determination to increase pressure on Russia and to give Ukraine the means to defend itself. This is what we're doing together with the European Union. By systematically attacking civilian targets and essential infrastructure, essential for daily life, Russia is trying to sow fear and discord in Ukraine. Unable to break through the front line for over 3 years now, Russia is trying to break the rearguard. Russia must understand that this strategy of massive and systematic violation of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions is not only illegal, what's more is it's useless. Russia will not manage to erode the morale of the Ukrainian people, and France would like to commend Ukraine's resilience and courage. France is also systematically targeting energy infrastructure. It is compromising without hesitation nuclear safety and security. In Chernobyl, our minister saw considerable damage that was done in February by a Russian Shahed drone, a drone which perforated the confinement sarcophagus, which prevents radioactive emissions. President, in Istanbul 2 days ago, Ukraine reiterated its readiness to implement an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as Ukraine has been doing for 5 months now. Russia once again refused. Russia reiterated its maximalist demands set out in the memorandum it gave to Ukraine on the 2nd of June. Russia cannot demand Ukraine's capitulation as a precondition for stopping the hostilities. President, in order to live up to its responsibilities, this Council cannot simply deplore civilian suffering and call for peace talks. The Council must, first, call a spade and recall the fundamentals of the conflict. Faced with Ukrainians' aspirations to liberty and democracy, it is Russia which on 2 occasions invaded Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, and this in flagrant violation of the Charter. Second, the Council must condemn violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, violations committed by Russia. We must call on it to put an end to this. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians constitute war crimes. Third, the Council must address its appeals to Russia, its appeals for an end to the fighting. It is Russia which can immediately put an end to this war of aggression and accept a ceasefire. Fourth, we must tirelessly recall that peace, in order to be lasting, must respect international law. Negotiations will only be effective if Russia accepts these negotiations in good faith and if it agrees to respect the independence, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ukraine's future security must be upheld. In the immediate future, there's a pressing need to call for a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. This is what Security Council Resolution 2774, which Russia voted in favor, calls for. It demands an end to the conflict as soon as possible. Let's respect it. I thank you.
Representative of France for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Pakistan for convening this meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Yencha and Assistant Secretary General Musuyev for their briefings. Mr. President, since the beginning of this war 3.5 years ago, the collective voice of the international community has repeatedly condemned Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and has been calling on Russia to fully respect international law, the UN Charter, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. These calls were strengthened with renewed conviction since the launching of the US-led peace initiative. Sadly, as we have just heard from our briefers, the war is not ending. On the contrary, for yet another month, Russian forces have been attacking the cities of Ukraine, causing death and destruction. June has been the single deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since at least May 2022, with the number of missiles and loitering munitions launched by Russia into Ukraine increasing tenfold from June 2024. Once more, the vulnerable, children, women, and the elderly are disproportionately affected, with 100 casualties among children alone. This trend has continued in July. These attacks have inter alia targeted energy infrastructure and disrupted power supply to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant for the first time since December 2023, further endangering nuclear safety. We note with extreme concern that according to the WHO, nearly 40% of all attacks against healthcare facilities worldwide this year took place in Ukraine, causing casualties among medical personnel and patients. We are likewise concerned about reports on the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. Greece joins the Secretary General in strong condemnation of the latest severe attacks by Russia against civilian population and infrastructure in Ukraine, and we also condemn any attacks against civilians which constitute blatant violations of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, this year's annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict verified a 105% increase in grave violations against the children of Ukraine, identifying for the third consecutive year the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups as responsible for these violations. These findings are compounded by this year's recently released Council of Europe's report on the human rights situation in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia, which demonstrates that Russia's war of aggression has continued to lead to immense human suffering. Mr. President, ensuring accountability is both a prerequisite for peace and a deterrent for further war. On that front, Greece welcomes the July 9th ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, in which the court held Russia unanimously accountable for flagrant and widespread abuses of at least 10 fundamental human rights in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and at least 2022. Greece also welcomes the signing of the agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, we have long advocated for peace, which is long overdue. We welcome the 3 rounds of direct bilateral talks and the agreements on exchange of prisoners, including the most recent one on July 23rd. However, we regret that peace efforts have not produced any other tangible results and have eventually stalled. We reiterate that no peace effort can have any substantial results if hostilities continue. Therefore, it is imperative that any peace efforts should be approached in good faith, starting by agreeing to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, in line with international law and the UN Charter, and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. Now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to thank ASG Yencha and ASG Umsuya for their informative briefings and welcome the participation of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, as the war in Ukraine stretches beyond 1,250 days, the human, moral, economic, and geopolitical costs of this aggression continues to mount. Contrary to the hopes of many who yearns to escape from this dark tunnel, Russia is intensifying its relentless attacks, now deploying hundreds of deadly drones and missiles daily. Indeed, June marked the highest monthly civilian casualty toll in 3 years, with 232 killed and 1,343 wounded. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and civilian suffering is deepening. We reiterate that such large-scale and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute a clear violations of international humanitarian law. The Republic of Korea once again strongly calls for a full, immediate, and unconditional cessation of hostilities to prevent further civilian casualties. In this regard, we support the recent call by the United States to achieve a long overdue ceasefire within 50 days. And we urge Russia to respond to this call, one that has been echoed by nearly every other member of the international community. Now more than ever, as the casualties continue to mount and the war shows no signs of abating, the urgency for a ceasefire is undeniable. We have already witnessed the concrete benefits of such a ceasefire during another major ongoing conflict. Although the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains dire today, earlier this year, during the fleeting ceasefire in Gaza, humanitarian conditions on the ground markedly improved. Hundreds of aid trucks were able to enter Gaza, delivering much-needed food, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies to suffering Palestinians. This clearly demonstrates that an immediate halt to hostilities is not merely symbolic. It is a vital step toward alleviating civilian suffering and creating the necessary space for diplomacy. On another front, we also take note of the third round of talks recently held between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul to seek an end to the conflict and bring about sustainable peace. We do not expect a miraculous breakthrough from just a few meetings. However, we do hope for the restoration of normalcy for the innocent civilians who have endured more than 3 years of immense hardship. They need a respite from the terrible nightly drone swarms, now numbering in the hundreds each day. We believe the realistic path to ending this war and achieving lasting peace begins with a prompt ceasefire agreement, followed by a sustained negotiations supported by confidence-building measures such as prisoner exchanges and return of fallen soldiers. These efforts must not be used to buy time for destructive or territorial ambitions, but instead must reflect the genuine political will to end this war. Mr. President, a major obstacle to achieving these goals lies in the ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK. Despite repeated condemnations from the international community, this illicit collaboration has been prolonging the war in Ukraine by enabling the large-scale transfer of ammunition, artillery, and missiles from the DPRK to Russia, as well as the deployment of North Korean troops in a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and relevant Security Council resolutions. Moreover, such cooperation poses grave risks to the security of the Republic of Korea and to regional stability. Potential military assistance and technological transfer from Russia to DPRK represent a serious and growing threat to the safety of the Korean people and to broader peace in Northeast Asia. We reiterate that all forms of cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang must fully comply with relevant Security Council resolution and international law. In closing, Mr. President, the international community can no longer afford to stand idly by while this senseless war continues. This is why we must come together, raising a united voice to demand an immediate ceasefire and pursue a just and lasting peace. We sincerely hope that those who initiate this war will heed the principled call of the international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thanking the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank ASG Yanka and ASG Monsieur for your informative briefings today. Colleagues, the world has rallied around President Trump's call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed, and we echo that call again today. Yet week after week, night after night, we see the number of Russian assaults grow. June was the deadliest month yet, and July is on track to be even deadlier. This makes a mockery of the diplomacy that Russia claims to support. And the consequences are even more devastating for the people of Ukraine. Across 5 nights, from the 18th to the 23rd of July, Russia launched over 940 drones and 59 missiles at Ukrainian cities, killing 20 civilians and injuring a further 216. Just days before, a record-breaking 728 long-range drones were launched on Ukraine in a single day. Since the start of the invasion, over 13,500 civilians have been killed and more than 34,000 injured. This includes more than 200 children killed or injured since March alone. We cannot allow ourselves to become desensitized to these figures. Behind each Russian strike, there is a person, a family, a community whose lives have been torn apart by Russia's brutal military invasion. The Shigids are one such family. On the 5th of June, as a Ukrainian firefighter arrived at the scene of a Russian attack on Chernihiv, he discovered that his wife, his daughter, and his grandson had all been killed. His grandson was only a year old. 3 generations lost to cold-blooded Russian brutality in just one night. This is not an isolated incident. Families like the Shigids are being torn apart across Ukraine and have been since February 2022. Russia has a clear and unqualified obligation to uphold the UN Charter. Russia also has an obligation to respect the Geneva Conventions and to the protection of civilians under international humanitarian law. There is simply no justification for brutal aggression like this. The reality is clear. Ukraine, a country illegally invaded by Russia, continues to show its commitment to peace. But President Putin prefers war. He is shunning diplomatic efforts made in good faith to bring an end to this horror, a horror of his own making. There is no ambiguity about what needs to come next. It is time for Russia to stop prevaricating and agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretaries General Yencha and Misuya for the updates provided and for their work. In the 33 days that have elapsed since our last meeting on this topic, the situation on the ground has gotten considerably worse. The continuation of intense fighting in several regions and escalated attacks on civilian infrastructure continue to devastate civilian lives and drive displacement in Ukraine. Meanwhile, nuclear safety and security remain under threat, with the IAEA reporting yesterday that their team at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to hear shelling, explosions, and gunfire almost every day. Earlier this month, the site's training center was targeted in a drone strike, resulting in damage to its roof. Guyana deplores the ongoing attacks on or near nuclear power stations, given the risk of severe and indiscriminate harm that could result. We call on the parties to the conflict to eliminate such plans from their military strategies. Mr. President, we have been consistent in reaffirming full respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Likewise, we have also been consistent in calling for a peaceful end to this war. We welcome the talks that have taken place in Istanbul and join fellow council members in welcoming the recent agreement for another round of exchanges of prisoners of war. Nevertheless, we have noted that these periods of progress continue to be interrupted by increased attacks and heightened rhetoric. We urge the parties to ensure that progress is sustained by prioritizing the protection of civilians, fulfilling their international legal obligations, and ultimately agreeing to end this war peacefully and definitively. Guyana believes that many opportunities have been missed since the adoption of Resolution 2774 5 months ago, a resolution which, while not perfect, provided the first glimmer of hope since this conflict erupted. 5 months on, it appears as if the main obstacles standing in the way of peace are the absence of firm political will and an unwillingness to compromise and find common ground. Meanwhile, the civilian death toll continues to mount, and many more lives are devastated and put on pause. We call on the parties to engage in good faith and to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children. This includes those displaced from their homes and mourning the loss of loved ones in both Ukraine and Russia. Guyana further reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and to comply with its obligation under international humanitarian law to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in the temporarily occupied territories. Mr. President, colleagues, it may be tempting, I'm sure, to imagine that one party will emerge victorious from this conflict. However, with nearly 50,000 civilian casualties reported to date and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis emerging, there will be no winners in this war. While the buildings are damaged can be rebuilt, the lives lost cannot be resuscitated, nor the injuries erased. But one thing remains clear: a call for peace is always relevant, and the choice of peace is never too late. The time to answer that call and to choose peace is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yensha and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya for your briefings. And I welcome the representative of Ukraine. More than 100 days have now passed since this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the war and urging a lasting peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Since then, there have been some positive developments. UN Security Council Resolution 2774 paved the way for technical talks in Saudi Arabia and bilateral talks in Istanbul, resulting in the return of thousands of prisoners of war. But the progress we've seen has fallen far short of what is needed. Ignoring this Council's call for lasting peace in Resolution 2774, Russia has continued to kill Ukrainian civilians. Russian drones and missiles have struck schools, playgrounds, apartment buildings, and nursing homes. Russia has deployed thousands of DPRK troops to its front lines and sent tens of thousands of Russian soldiers to die on the battlefield just to gain a small amount of ground. Mr. President, colleagues, the war, killing, and destruction must end. As President Trump has repeatedly stated, there is no military solution to this conflict. On July 14th, the President of the United States put Russian President Putin on notice to agree to a peace deal within 50 days. If Russia does not agree within that time frame to stop the attacks, the United States is prepared to take further measures. Additionally, we again urge all countries, including China, to stop exports to Russia of dual-use goods that contribute to Russia's war industrial base and enable its drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. Beijing's claim to have implemented strong export controls on dual-use goods falls apart in the face of daily recovery of Chinese-produced components in the drones, weapons, and vehicles that Russia uses against Ukraine. Mr. President, now is the time for all UN member states to do our part to bring this war to an end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I wish to express my appreciation to ASG Yanka and Masuya for their briefing. My delegation remains gravely concerned by the continued deterioration of the humanitarian and security situation in Ukraine. The latest developments only reinforce the urgency and the complexity of the crisis before us. In that regard, I would like to make the following points. First, we are deeply troubled by the ongoing escalation of attacks impacting civilians and essential civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilians and critical infrastructure are obligations enshrined under international law. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. Second, we remain convinced that there can be no military solution to this conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy are the sole means to bring an end to this long-standing conflict and achieve sustainable peace. Continued hostilities serve only to prolong suffering and further diminish prospect for a sustainable peace. Diplomatic channels must remain open. In that context, we welcome the ongoing discussions in Istanbul between the Russian Federation and Ukraine concerning the exchange of prisoners of war. While these negotiations are not without challenges, they represent a constructive step on the humanitarian track. Progress, even incremental, on such issues can pave the way for broader engagement and contribute to building the trust necessary for peace. Third, we emphasize the important role of the international community in supporting diplomatic initiatives and fostering conditions conducive to a peaceful settlement. Any durable resolution will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and genuine commitment to dialogue. We reiterate our call upon all parties to exercise restraint, recommit to diplomatic efforts, and work towards an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. In closing, Mr. President, our delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all efforts aimed at addressing the underlying causes of the conflict and achieving a just and lasting peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this crisis deserve a future founded upon peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Panama regrets the accident that occurred yesterday in the Russian Federation, and we'd like to extend our condolences to the relatives of those who lost their lives, as well as the people and government of Russia. President, we welcome the convening of this briefing and the timely participation of Mr. Yensha, ASG, and Ms. Msuya, ASG. They have provided us with detailed information about the humanitarian situation and security situation in Ukraine. Panama continues to be deeply concerned by the prolonged war in Ukraine. It is alarming that this conflict, with its devastating humanitarian consequences, has become a regular item on our agenda. We should not allow violence to lose its ability to move us, nor for the normalization of suffering to be imposed upon our collective responsibility. Like in any conflict, those who are most affected, those who bear the brunt, are those who have the least responsibility, that is to say, civilians who only wish to live in peace. This reality should compel us to ask ourselves, have we really learned from the tragedies that characterize the 20th century? Attacks on schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure, an increasingly vulnerable population, physically and emotionally exhausted. All of this cannot and must not be normalized. The detailed reports that Mr. Yensha and Ms. Msuya have provided us today clearly show with eloquent figures the lamentable effects of the attacks and the collective and individual tolls of the attacks on civilians, as well as human displacement and the deterioration of the humanitarian situation. And this is in addition to the increasing cost of the reconstruction of Ukraine. All of these are sad consequences of the conflict, which, rather than winding down, continues without any prospect of a solution. We do not think enough about the victims of the fighting, and the reports have shown that approximately 950,000 Russian soldiers have died or have been injured, and some 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died since the conflict erupted. Every day that passes without our acting deepens the collective trauma and erodes the minimal bases of the social contract. We cannot allow fear and despair to prevail over security and dignity. We urgently need to redouble diplomatic and humanitarian efforts to protect those who are not able to protect themselves, in line with our obligations pursuant to the Geneva Conventions. President, we are gathered here today in this chamber, which was as a result of the 1955 spirit, precisely to avoid situations such as those in the past recurring. However, the figures that we've heard this morning and that we continue to hear every month defy this founding commitment. We are particularly concerned about nuclear security. At the beginning of this month, an attack completely disconnected the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. On the 13th of July, the the IAEA team reported shots from light weapons being fired close to the power station, and in addition to this, incidents with drones in the surroundings. As DG Grossi has clearly said, the situation around the power plant is increasingly delicate and sensitive, and any incident could have catastrophic consequences. Panama echoes the words of S.G. Guterres, which he stated on the 5th of June, in which he condemned the wide-scale attacks with missiles and drones. The continued attacks continue to be one of the main characteristics of the conflict, and this represents a major threat to regional and global stability. Fair and lasting peace in Ukraine necessarily involves fully respecting Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, pursuant to the principles laid out in the UN Charter. We urge the parties to immediately cease hostilities and to fulfill their obligations pursuant to international law, including international humanitarian law. In February of this year, one of this Council's resolutions offered a window of opportunity to a negotiated solution. Unfortunately, this opportunity was not taken advantage of. In this regard, we encourage the parties to continue direct talks, such as the talks that were held this week in Istanbul, which led to a new agreement for the exchange of prisoners of war. In addition to this, we reiterate that only through dialogue, diplomacy, and respect for these principles will it be possible to curb this spiral of suffering and to restore a peaceful and sustainable solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this important meeting at the request of Slovenia, Denmark, France, Greece, the Republic of Korea, and the United Kingdom. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenča and Ms. Joyce Musia for their comprehensive and sobering briefings. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, the end of the Ukraine conflict remains a complex but not insurmountable objective. Encouragingly, 3 rounds of talks in Istanbul between the parties have facilitated the exchange of thousands of prisoners of war and detainees, as well as progress in the return of over 300 Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation. While a ceasefire agreement remains elusive, such confidence-building measures, alongside the reported intention to establish joint working groups to regularly address political, humanitarian, and military dimensions, offer signs of continued engagement through diplomatic channels. In this regard, we wish to make 3 key points. First, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned by the indiscriminate use of long-range missiles and drones in densely populated areas, resulting in widespread civilian suffering and destruction of civilian infrastructure. According to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, missile and drone attacks in June 2025 were 10-fold higher during the same period last year, causing extensive damage to energy, water, medical, and other vital civilian infrastructure. Since the beginning of this year, approximately 6,754 civilians have reportedly lost their lives, including an alarming increase in casualties among children. Reports from UNICEF further indicate that about 70% of the children in Ukraine, roughly 3.5 million, are facing severe material deprivation, including lack of access to food, clothing, heating, and education. For more than 3 years, the lives of these children have been shaped by fear, loss, and trauma, a situation that must not be normalized. In this regard, we underscore the urgent need to sustain and strengthen humanitarian assistance to reach the estimated 12.7 million people currently in need across Ukraine. We reiterate that the protection of civilians must be central to all military operations, with strict adherence to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, and call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international law. Second, we urge the parties to the conflict to demonstrate the necessary political will and commit to structured negotiations aimed at achieving a sustainable resolution of the conflict. Building on the progress made in Istanbul, we join others in encouraging high-level political dialogue to address substantive matters for a ceasefire and a lasting peace. We welcome reports of private engagements between the heads of the respective delegations and urge continued negotiations in good faith with a focus on political and humanitarian priorities. We commend the sustained efforts of the United States, European leaders, and other partners in support of a comprehensive ceasefire. In light of the deep human suffering caused by the conflict, we appeal to the parties to prioritize the well-being of their citizens and seize the opportunity to bring an end to hostilities. Third and finally, the international community must begin to prepare for the post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization of Ukraine. The scale of devastation is immense. An estimated 139,000 square kilometers of territory are reportedly contaminated with landmines and explosive remnants of war, posing enduring threats to safety and livelihood. Short-term financial requirements for budgetary support, reconstruction, and humanitarian assistance have been estimated at approximately 40 billion annually by the Kyiv School of Economics. According to the World Bank's Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment done in February this year, long-term reconstruction costs may amount to over 524 billion in the coming decade. Thus, the challenge ahead is significant. We welcome international coordination mechanisms supporting Ukraine's recovery, including the Multi-Donor Coordination Platform and the Ukraine Recovery Conference. The guiding principles are outlined in the Lugalo Declaration: partnership, reform focus, transparency, democratic participation, inclusivity,